Welcome to the Invisible Wheelchair Podcast. The Invisible Wheelchair Podcast was selected by FeedSpot as one of the top 10 obsessive compulsive disorder podcasts on the web. I'm Donald Grodoff, EFT tapping practitioner and OCD coach at FamilyOCD.com. On the Invisible Wheelchair Podcast, I focus on the hidden world of OCD and anxiety with interviews and information around this topic. My purpose is to bring about awareness of OCD, those who treat OCD, and of course, those who suffer with OCD. Obsessive compulsive disorder is a treatable and manageable disorder. In my practice at FamilyOCD.com, I guide people through the process of ERP therapy and other alternative treatments. If you know of someone suffering with OCD, I can help. Simply visit FamilyOCD.com. If you or someone you know suffers or has suffered and recovered from OCD and would like to get their story out, simply contact us through www.invisiblewheelchair.com. We want to talk to you and get your story out on the podcast. Know that the ideas and thoughts presented here are not necessarily those of Family OCD, Invisible Wheelchair Podcast, or Donald Grodoff. We also ask you to take just a few moments and leave comments at www.invisiblewheelchair.com. Those comments help us to know what the next topic should be, and we really want to hear from you. Now, let's get to that podcast. Jenna Overbaugh is a licensed professional counselor and therapist specializing in OCD and anxiety at NOCD, an online OCD specialized therapy group. Previously, she worked as a therapist in a clinical setting with Rogers Behavioral Health, a residential recovery unit for OCD and anxiety. She loves being a podcaster, an Instagrammer, certified personal trainer, and especially being a mom. Previously, you heard her story on the Stories from the OCD side, which is about her personal journey through OCD herself. Now, we're going to talk to her about her professional life as a OCD specialized therapist. So let's get to that interview now. So Jenna, welcome back. I'm so glad that you've come back, and now we want to be able to talk a little bit more about what you do and the work you do, because it's really, you're doing some great stuff. So welcome back to the Invisible Wheelchair Podcast, and again, thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'll have to flip off the personal switch and flip on the professional switch.
Yes,
But,
yes, and
yeah,
and there'll be a mix of that because it blends together as it is. So,
absolutely.
we've talked about the idea of maybe giving an example of a case that you worked on. Maybe it's a unique case of some sort that, and what happened with it and how it ended up and all that. So maybe you
Yeah,
could
so
share a story like that with us.
sure, that would be great. So I worked with someone who struggled a lot with the concept of anything that was not 100% all organic. This was a really severe case in that this person, whether it was laundry detergent or toothpaste or a toothbrush, not to even mention food, like obviously food was all 100% all organic. But even clothing, like I didn't even realize that they made 100% all organic clothing. I didn't realize that they had 100% all organic shoes. I just didn't know that even existed. But so this person was so afraid of chemicals, anything that like might cause cancer, basically anything that wasn't 100% organic. And so all the way, like I said, down to shoes, laundry detergent, toothpaste, food, you name it. Yeah, it was obviously interfering with their life in such a way that they weren't able to go out into the, public. They weren't able to go, to really do anything that they wanted to do. Their activities of daily living were severely compromised because of obviously, think about the things that we touch and consume on a daily basis that aren't 100% all organic, right? Like it's everything. It just really, they were underweight because of the food not being having to be so restricted. And so it was my job with exposure and response prevention to gradually get this person to not only consume foods that weren't all 100%, organic. I also had to get them to use different laundry detergent, use different hand soap, use different toothpaste, use different shoes, different clothes. And they were so resistant. They had no interest in being able to use different toothpaste. They had no interest in being able to use different shoes. And so it was really difficult because we were doing exposures like, yeah, let's find this still organic toothpaste, but at least it's a different brand than the one that they were used to. Or, how about we have you just look at a printed out picture of Tide Pods, right? Like I was trying like every nook and cranny for exposure wise, that we could kind of get them to do, and nothing was working. They just didn't feel that burdened by it. And as some of you know, like especially caregivers or other professionals, if someone's not really truly burdened enough by their OCD, not much is going to change. I had a really hard time even getting this person to kind of get their foot in the door. It was really challenging. But they did have one article of clothing that they bought from a random department store that they loved. And maybe it was like a band t-shirt or some like cartoon shirt or something, but they loved it. And it was obviously not organic. It was just like a regular shirt that you would get from the store. And they were so motivated by that shirt. And I, like my own stubbornness was like, I don't want to do exposures with this shirt. They need to learn how to brush their teeth with regular toothpaste. But I was like, you know what? Like I'm desperate. Like we're going to use this shirt. They were really motivated by this shirt. And I was like, you know what? Obviously, we can't stop there. We will need to get this person to do other things, but I'm going to stuff my pride aside and we're going to just do it one step at a time. And so we literally like stood in a room with that shirt outside of the plastic bag. We brought the shirt closer and closer. Then we had them like touch the sleeve of the shirt with a couple fingers. And then we had them hold on to the shirt and then put the shirt against their clothes, then put the shirt against their bare skin, and then eventually put it on, right? That's the whole concept of this like graduated exposure. And it was honestly so long ago, like I don't know to what extent we were able to get them through therapy, but definitely that opened up the door to other opportunities because they suddenly took this one exposure that they were really motivated to work on. And then they were like, okay, I guess it works, right? And so they were more willing to work on these other areas. So I guess the moral of the story there is like above and beyond just the example of how to do graduated exposure with something like that. It's also that sometimes, it's really beneficial to focus on what the person really, really, really wants to change or what they really want to work on, and then let everything else kind of come after that. Sometimes they're just not as motivated to do laundry. They're going to have to eventually do laundry, right? But if they're really motivated by a shirt or a certain toy or a car or whatever, like you might have to work with that first.
And we might have gone a little backwards in this, but kind of talking a little bit more about what you do now. You are a therapist for specializing in OCD. What types of treatment, and we can talk a little bit more. I've talked about ERP and done two or three at least podcasts on that, but talk about the treatments you use and how you use them.
Yes, like you said, I specialize in the treatment of OCD and anxiety. The gold standard treatment for OCD and anxiety is exposure and response prevention, so ERP. And so what that basically requires of clients and professionals is you'll essentially work with your client to come up with exposures. And so exposures in the example that I gave were holding the shirt against their body, touching the shirt, so on and so forth. Things that are basically anxiety provoking and that they would normally do by washing after or doing some type of compulsion after. And then, of course, you all obviously also need that ritual prevention piece or that response prevention piece, which could be different for everybody. Tons of different subtypes, obviously, with OCD, but with that person, it was not washing the shirt before, it was not washing their body after. And so what we find is that by gradually exposing yourself to these anxiety provoking things and not doing these compulsions afterwards, you get used to the anxiety provoking thing, which is what we call habituation. And you also learn a couple of things. You basically learn that you can tolerate it. You learn that your worst case scenario isn't as probable or as likely or as catastrophic. You learn that you can tolerate the anxiety and that doesn't last forever. It's really a matter of changing your relationship with anxiety. We don't get rid of the intrusive thoughts. We work on your relationship with those thoughts and the behaviors that you do to try to figure those thoughts out or to try to make those thoughts feel better.
I was curious, and with yourself, you've worked in a clinical situation. You worked at Rogers for quite a while, in office working on that, and now you're working for the NOCD organization, which is really touts itself on being online and working, kind of remotely with people. What do you see is the difference? Have you found a big difference in how you do things with those two different scenarios?
Yeah, absolutely. So it is already a huge difference outside of even the fact that one was obviously in person and one is obviously teletherapy. I think it was also a huge difference of residential versus outpatient. Residential was really severe. We were working on basic things, basically just to get them ready for the next level of care. Whereas outpatient, it's more complex exposures, I think. Like they're not just as basic as go brush your teeth in under 15 minutes. It's a little bit more like real life, like things that they can do at work, things that they can do actually in the home. I guess the biggest differences that I see, and one of the cool benefits that I see of teletherapy is that we actually get to work with the people in their home, right?
Uh,
Like in their actual triggered environment. And so I can't tell you how many times people came to us at Rogers, and residential is incredible if you need it, but we struggled because they felt like their bedroom was contaminated. And so when they
uh,
come to Rogers, they obviously don't care because it's not their bedroom. There was always this, when it came to those cases, and it wasn't always like that, but when it came to those cases, we always had to be very, very creative. We had to have family members send contaminated items in the mail, have them send contaminated items back home, be creative with pictures and mom and dad doing stuff back home. And it was doable, but it's so much cooler to do it like we have access to all of the things that these people are struggling with because they're in that environment right now. There's definitely a difference in exposures that you are able to do and a difference in the exposures that you want to do with them, that you're able to do with them.
that's I hadn't thought about that, but that's very true.
Yeah.
Because we work with it within our home, and it makes I think would make a difference. So the one other thing, because you've told your own story. You've been through the OCD. If anybody hasn't listened to that podcast, that one is one under the stories from the OCD side where you told your story about going through it postpartum OCD yourself. Well, having done that and now being on the other side of, I shouldn't say I guess that's the other side of it. How do you see yourself treating people? I don't know if this is the right way to say it, but treating people differently. Is there a difference between how you treated them before and how you treat them now that you've been through it? You've experienced it.
Yeah. I think I'm definitely more compassionate. I'm definitely more patient and more understanding. I think in the previous podcast, I mentioned, like, I think before I was very much a drill sergeant and like a personal trainer type of therapist. Like, we got to go. Come on, tough love. And I still have that, but I'm way more compassionate and patient with people now because I've been there myself, even if it's just a little bit, right? Like I've been there and I saw the other side of it. I think also I've been way more driven to do as relevant and as high priority exposures as possible. At residential years ago when I first started, we saw people doing things like laying face down on the bathroom floor and eating pieces of food off the bathroom floor. And like, those are all great. And like, what are, like, that's fine. Can you give your son a bath? Right? Like, I have become way more intentional about the exposures that I assign because I want people to see the implications of how these things can actually change their day-to-day life. Laying face down on a bathroom floor, sure. I would be more interested, like, can you accidentally drop an item of clothing on the floor and still wear it? Because that's just something that happens by mistake every once in a while. Like, I don't know if I'm making it clear, but I just, instead of doing these kind of like silly, quote unquote, or like overcorrecting exposures, I still think they have their place in their time for sure. I'm just I guess my first go-to is like, okay, what's most relevant in their life? How do I take like what's literally affecting them on a day-to-day basis and change that with response prevention versus just having them do this kind of like arbitrary or ridiculous thing that will, yes, make them anxious and will, yes, help them in their recovery. But can we have things that are going to be useful and helpful in their recovery and that are relevant? That's kind of been my shift.
Well, and it sounds what I'm hearing is that you're kind of making it even more personal,
Yes.
the versus just doing a book idea, or a theory idea. You're doing something that fits them specifically, which sounds perfect. Sounds
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. I was always taught that hierarchies, even if you have two people who have harm OCD, should never look the same. Someone with harm OCD, they may be struggling with knives. They may be someone else with harm OCD may be struggling with guns. Like, it has to be personal to them. It has to be tailored to them. And I have a pet peeve when it comes to these like very repetitive kind of like uncreative exposures, like write the word pedophile. Okay, that's great. And that will be fine. But what if I have them change their son's diaper and not ask their husband for reassurance after? Right? Like, that's more relevant.
Well, another thing you mentioned, and I heard this with one other therapist, is you talked about value,
Yeah.
and I thought that was very interesting because that's something I thought about in my mind, but not knowing how that really works. Would you mind talking just a little bit more? Because I know you mentioned that you really talk about their value, what they value in life, and how to head towards that value. At least that's the way I was interpreting it. So can you talk just a little bit more about the value part of what you do?
Yeah. So I think values are hugely important in just the conceptualization of OCD and the treatment for it. So my personal opinion, and this comes from Dr. Michael Greenberg, who I'm not sure if you're familiar with, but he's awesome. He's a licensed psychologist who specializes in OCD treatment, and he's really big on his work with rumination. And so, but I think it's applicable to really anything in OCD. He says that there's essentially like this trajectory when we have an intrusive thought. One, a thought occurs to us. We can't help that. Two, we become aware of that thought. We can't necessarily help that either. We're just aware that we're having a thought. And then at that point, I think it becomes a choice point. And that's where I think values come into play. Three, after we become aware that we're having a thought, three is attention. How much attention are we willing to give to this thought? How much mental energy or effort are we willing to expend or deposit into this thought? And then the fourth one is this analysis, right? Like analysis with rumination, mental reviewing, you're self-assuring yourself, going through scenarios, any kind of like engagement with that, right? Not to mention even the observable compulsions that you might do. How I bring that back to values is when you're at that point where you have a thought occurs to you and then you become aware of it, how much attention you give to that intrusive thought will, I think, be dictated by your values. So this all happens every single time that you or I or anyone gets in the car. We all sit with the uncertainty that we could get in a car accident and it could be fatal and we could die. We still get in the car, right? Like we might have that thought occur to us like, oh, I almost ran that red light. Like I could have gotten in a car and I could have died. I could have gotten in an accident. We become aware of that thought, but we don't necessarily give a lot of that thought very much attention, right? Like, and that's a choice, right? Because our values are independence, being able to drive, not relying on other people, getting to work on time, picking my son up from daycare. Like my values, I value so many other things than I value giving attention to the thought that I could get in a car accident and die. I think when it comes to that trajectory, one, a thought occurs to you, two, awareness. Then I think there's that choice point in between 2 and 3 where you dictate like, okay, am I moving in the direction of my values? Are my values going to win, or is my OCD going to win? Then I think depending on what you choose, right? If you choose your values, then you move on with your day. You continue moving on with your values as you see fit. You continue to drive, even though you had the thought occurred to you that you could get in a fatal car accident. You continue to go to work because you value being on time. Or if your OCD wins and you value that more and having certainty more, then you give attention to that intrusive thought and you get stuck in the analysis of that. Oh my gosh, could I actually get in a car accident? I need to pull over and check the weather conditions. I need to see if my husband can come and get me. I need to pull over on the side of the road.
Wow.
And I think values play a huge part in that fork in the road.
That's great. That explains it. I appreciate that. Well, Jenna, last thing I wanted to do was, if people, my audience wants to know more about you, what's the best things they can do to find out about you, find about NOCD? So if you want to lay out some different places or things they could do to find you, that would be great.
Awesome. Yeah. So if anyone wants to know more about OCD or about exposure and response prevention, there's tons of different ways that you can find more about it. So I have kind of an educational Instagram about these topics. So you can find me over at jenna.overbaugh. I also have a podcast. So it's called All the Hard Things, also all about OCD and exposure and response prevention. It's available on all podcast platforms. And then finally, if anyone out there is struggling with OCD, then you can go to treatingocd.com. You can schedule a free 15-minute phone call. It's a mobile therapy app for obsessive compulsive disorder. You can get hooked up with a therapist for weekly sessions. You have a ton of in-app tools that are free for you to use if you just download the NOCD app on your marketplace. Lots of really great stuff and lots of help that's out there and available to you. In addition to obviously continuing to find these awesome podcasts, NOCD is also a really great option for your recovery.
I'll remind my audience that I will have that up on the invisiblewheelchair.com podcast site, and I also have her podcast up there too to find that. So Jenna, thank you so much for doing these interviews. It's been wonderful to hear your story and then to know about what you do and how you do your work I think the work you're doing is tremendous because there's not enough of us out there to working on this, and it's important to have everybody advocating for OCD. So again, thank you for being part of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And you guys, the OCD community is so strong. So as much as it sucks to deal with, the treatment for it is robust and it's effective. And the community for it, especially on podcasts and Instagram and stuff like that, is super, super strong. So keep up all the awesome work and keep coming back for some more good podcast episodes.
All right. This concludes this podcast. We really would appreciate your comments. Simply leave a comment at www.invisiblewheelchair.com. There, you're able to submit a comment that will help us determine future podcasts. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the podcast, please email don@invisiblewheelchair.com. Remember, there is a corresponding tapping recording for each of the podcasts, with the exception of the interview podcast. You can find these tapping recordings and archive past podcasts at www.invisiblewheelchair.com. Finally, there is relief for OCD, and we at FamilyOCD.com and FocusedHealthyFamily.com can help you find that relief. Again, you can contact us through those sites, FamilyOCD.com or FocusedHealthyFamily.com. You can also find us on Facebook at Invisible Wheelchair Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at InvisibleWheel1, that's the number 1, or at Family OCD. So thank you for listening. Keep tapping and transcending your life to new heights.